The crystal flute chimed against the silence of the room, a sharp, piercing sound that seemed to freeze time itself. My daughter-in-law, Isabella St. James, stood at the head of the mahogany dining table, her manicured fingers clutching the stem of her wine glass. Her face was flushed with the expensive vintage Pinot Noir I had paid for, and her lips curled into that familiar, condescending smirk I had learned to tolerate over the last 18 years. The air in the penthouse dining room, usually filled with the hum of polite conversation and the clinking of silverware, went dead still. "Here's to Evelyn," Isabella announced, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that barely masked the venom beneath. "To the woman who signs the checks, funds the lifestyle, and keeps the lights on, but who, let's be honest, will never truly be a mother to us. Just the bank." Her words hung in the air like toxic smoke. I sat perfectly still at the other end of the table, my napkin folded precisely across my lap, my posture as rigid as the steel beams that supported the skyscrapers visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My son Julian sat to her right. He was 42 years old, a man who should have been in the prime of his life, yet he looked down at his plate of filet mignon, studying the sear marks as if they held the secrets of the universe. He didn't speak. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look up to meet my eyes. The other guests, a collection of Isabella's socialite friends whom I had never met before tonight, exchanged awkward, horrified glances, unsure whether to laugh or pretend they hadn't heard the insult. Isabella took a sip of her wine, looking around the room with a triumphant gleam in her eyes, as if she had just delivered the punchline to the world's greatest joke. 18 years. I let the number roll through my mind. 18 years of financing every whim, every failure, every luxury, and every fabricated emergency this family could conjure up. I looked at Julian, seeing not the man he was, but the shadow of the boy I had raised, now reduced to a silent accomplice in his wife's cruelty. I took a slow, deliberate breath, inhaling the scent of the fresh lilies in the center of the table. Lilies I had ordered. Without uttering a single word, I reached into my clutch purse. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of a heavy, golden key. I pulled it out, letting the light from the chandelier catch its ridges, and placed it gently on the table. Next to it, I laid a folded piece of heavy cream stationery that I had prepared that very morning, propelled by a premonition I hadn't wanted to believe. The metal key clattered against the polished wood, a sound that echoed with finality. It was the sound of a prison door opening, though they didn't know it yet. Julian's eyes snapped up. He saw the key, the master key to this very penthouse, the deed to which was solely in my name. And then his eyes drifted to the note. His face, previously flushed with embarrassment, drained of all color, turning the shade of old parchment. "Mom," Julian stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Tell me you aren't doing this. Please." I didn't answer. I didn't even look at Isabella, whose smirk was faltering into a look of confusion. I simply stood up. My charcoal silk dress rustled softly as I smoothed it down. I turned on my heel and walked toward the double doors of the entrance, the click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds of their remaining comfort. I was leaving behind 18 years of humiliation disguised as familial duty. Every step away from that table felt lighter, as if invisible chains were snapping one by one. The note I left was simple, devoid of emotion, and legally binding. It read, "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The eviction notice will be served by my attorney tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. As I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, the silence of the descending car wrapped around me. I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. I was Evelyn St. James. 72 years old, the matriarch of a textile empire that I had built from the ground up after my husband Arthur passed away. I looked at the woman in the mirror, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon, her eyes sharp and green, undimmed by age. For too long I had played the role of the doting, vulnerable widow desperate for connection. That role ended tonight. The drive back to my own estate in the Hudson Valley was long, but I welcomed the solitude. The rhythm of the tires on the asphalt gave me time to think, time to remember how we had arrived at this precipice. I remembered arriving at that penthouse nearly 2 decades ago, handing a set of keys to a 24-year-old Julian and his beaming bride. I was a widow then, heartbroken over the loss of Arthur, my partner in life and business. Julian was all I had left of him. At first, the financial support seemed natural, almost necessary. They were young, just starting out in a city that chewed people up and spit them out. I had the means. They had the dreams. I paid the down payment on their first apartment, a sensible 2-bedroom in Brooklyn. Then came the upgrade to the SUV because they started talking about safety. Then came the delayed honeymoon to the Amalfi Coast because they had been too stressed to enjoy the wedding I had paid for. It was a slow creep, a cancer that metastasized over years. Isabella had a unique talent for weaponizing guilt. She would sigh theatrically, looking at a bill or a shop window and say, "It must be so freeing not to worry about the cost of things, Evelyn. I wish Julian and I could provide that kind of peace for our future children." And like a fool, blinded by the desire to be close to my son, I would open the checkbook. I became their personal sovereign wealth fund. Every month, a transfer of $4,000 hit their account for basic expenses. I paid the mortgage, the maintenance fees, the car insurance, the cell phone plans, and the memberships to clubs they rarely visited. When my grandchildren, Sophie and Leo, were born, I covered the best obstetricians, the night nurses, the designer wardrobes, and eventually the tuition for private schools that cost more than most people earned in a year. I had run the numbers earlier that day with my accountant. Over 18 years, I had spent nearly $600,000 supporting Julian and Isabella. And what did I have to show for it? Not gratitude, not love, only expectation. They looked at me and saw a walking wallet. The dinner tonight was supposed to be a celebration of the company's 50th anniversary, a milestone I was incredibly proud of. But from the moment I arrived, I felt the shift in the atmosphere. The guests were Isabella's friends, people who had never worked a day in their lives, looking at me with a mixture of pity and arrogance. Isabella's toast was the final straw, the moment the illusion shattered. She didn't just insult me, she erased me. She reduced my entire existence to a financial transaction. But as I merged onto the highway leading out of the city, I realized she had done me a favor. She had severed the emotional cord I hadn't been strong enough to cut myself. I arrived at my estate, a sprawling stone house overlooking the river, just before midnight. The house was dark, but it felt welcoming, unlike the cold, sterile luxury of the penthouse I allowed them to inhabit. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, Arthur's favorite brand, and sat in his leather armchair in the library. The smell of old books and wood polish grounded me. My phone had been buzzing incessantly in my purse. I finally pulled it out. 17 missed calls from Julian, 12 from Isabella, a barrage of text messages ranging from confused to apologetic to angry. I turned the phone off and placed it on the side table. Tonight I would sleep. Tomorrow, the war would begin. The next morning, the sun broke over the Hudson River with a brilliance that felt like a benediction. I woke up at 6, my internal clock set by decades of running a corporation. I dressed in a tailored navy suit, the kind of armor I wore when I was negotiating a takeover or firing an incompetent executive. I pulled my hair back tight. The grandmother who baked cookies and signed checks was gone. The CEO was back in charge. My first call was to the bank. It was 8 a.m., and my private banker, Mr. Henderson, answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Mrs. St. James," he said, his voice professional and warm. "How can I assist you this morning?" "Good morning, Charles. I need to make some immediate changes to my standing orders," I said, my voice steady. I need to cancel all recurring transfers to the joint account of Julian and Isabella St. James, effective immediately. There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. All of them. Evelyn, the mortgage, the allowance, the tuition payments, everything, Charles, every single penny. Furthermore, I want to cancel the supplementary credit cards issued under my account for both of them. Understood, he said, though I could hear the surprise in his hesitation. I'll put the stop orders in now. The cards will be declined the next time they are swiped. Is there anything else? Yes. I want a full audit of the credit card usage for the last 12 months on those supplementary cards. I want to know exactly what was purchased and where. I hung up and called my attorney, Marcus Sterling. Marcus had been with me since Arthur died. He was a shark in a three-piece suit and exactly who I needed right now. Marcus, I said when he picked up. I trust the eviction papers for the Park Avenue penthouse are ready to be served. They are on the courier's truck as we speak, Evelyn, Marcus replied. 30 days' notice, as per state law. Since there is no lease and they pay no rent, they are tenants at will. You are well within your rights, though I warned you this would be nuclear. It needs to be, I said. I also want you to draft a new will. I am removing Julian as the primary beneficiary. Evelyn, Marcus started, his tone softening. That is a permanent move. Are you sure? I have never been more sure of anything, Marcus. He is a 42-year-old man who cannot stand on his own 2 feet because I have crippled him with money. If I die tomorrow, he will burn through the estate in 5 years and leave my grandchildren with nothing. I need to protect the legacy, even if it means cutting him off. By 10 a.m., the fallout began. I had turned my phone back on, and it immediately lit up with Julian's name. I let it ring, then Isabella, then the landline in the penthouse. I ignored them all. I sat in my study, reviewing the preliminary credit card statements Charles had emailed over. It was worse than I thought. I had assumed the cards were used for groceries, gas, perhaps the occasional dinner. But as I scrolled through the PDF, my blood ran cold. Saks Fifth Avenue, $3,500. Sephora, $600. A business trip to Miami that coincided with a music festival, $4,200. There were charges for high-end liquor stores, designer handbags, and exclusive salon treatments. They weren't just living off me, they were looting me. Then the phone rang again. It was Julian. I decided it was time. I swiped the screen. "Mom!" Julian yelled, his voice bordering on hysteria. "What is going on?" "Isabella is at the grocery store. Her card was declined. She was humiliated. And there's a process server here handing me eviction papers." "Have you lost your mind?" "Good morning, Julian," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "I hope you slept well." "Slept well? How could I sleep well? You walked out without saying a word. And now this? You're cutting us off? We have bills, Mom. We have the kids." "You have bills, Julian. I have been the one paying them. That's not fair. You know I'm working on my startup. I can't deal with this financial stress right now. Your startup has been in the ideation phase for 6 years, Julian. You are 42. You spend your days playing golf and your nights drinking my wine. And your wife made it very clear last night that my only value to this family is monetary. So I have removed the money. Now we shall see what value remains." There was a silence on the line, heavy and suffocating. "Mom," he whispered, his anger deflating into fear. She was drunk. She didn't mean it. In vino veritas, Julian. In wine, there is truth. She said exactly what she thought. And the worst part isn't what she said. It's that you sat there and let her say it. You watched her humiliate the woman who put the roof over your head and the clothes on your back, and you didn't say a word. I was shocked. I didn't know what to do. And that is the problem. You never know what to do because you've never had to solve a problem in your life. I solved them all for you. Well, I am retiring from that job. You have 30 days, Julian. If you are not out of my apartment by noon on the 30th day, the sheriff will remove you. I hung up before he could respond. My hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally standing up for myself. Around noon, I decided to drive into the village for lunch. I went to a small bistro I used to frequent with Arthur. I ordered a Cobb salad and an iced tea, opened a novel I had been meaning to read for months, and sat by the window. It felt strange to be unburdened. For years, every meal had been interrupted by a text from Isabella asking for a transfer or a call from Julian complaining about a contractor at the house. Today, my phone was silent because I had blocked their numbers for the next few hours. The waitress, a young woman named Sarah who had worked there for years, smiled as she refilled my tea. "Mrs. St. James, you look different today. Lighter." "I feel lighter, Sarah." I smiled back. "I feel like I just dropped 200 pounds of dead weight." As I ate, I thought about my grandchildren, Sophie and Leo. Sophie was 16, sharp-witted and observant. Leo was 13, a gentle boy who loved video games and soccer. They were the innocent casualties in this war. I knew Isabella would weaponize them. She would paint me as the villain, the wicked grandmother who stole their home. I had to get ahead of the narrative. I finished my lunch and sent a text to Sophie. "Meet me at the tea room on Main Street tomorrow at 4 p.m. Bring Leo. Don't tell your parents. This is between us." Sophie replied almost instantly. "Okay, Grandma, is everything okay? Mom is crying and Dad is throwing things. Everything is going to be fine, darling. See you tomorrow." That evening, I didn't retreat. I poured a glass of wine and sat on my porch, watching the sunset over the river. I wasn't just angry, I was disappointed in myself. I had let my grief for Arthur turn me into an enabler. I had thought that by giving Julian everything he wanted, I was compensating for the loss of his father. Instead, I had robbed him of the most important lesson a man can learn, the pride of earning his own way. The next afternoon, Sophie and Leo walked into the tea room. They looked terrified. Sophie was holding Leo's hand, a protective gesture that broke my heart. They sat down opposite me. I had ordered a tower of sandwiches and pastries, their favorites. "Grandma," Leo asked, his voice trembling, "are we poor now?" "Mom says we're going to be homeless." I reached across the table and took both of their hands. "Look at me. You are not going to be homeless. Your parents are going through a difficult transition, but nobody is going to starve." "Why are you doing this?" Sophie asked, her eyes narrowing. She had Isabella's fire, but thankfully, my logic. "Mom said you went crazy. She said you're vindictive." "Sophie? Leo?" I said gently. "Do you know who pays for the apartment you live in?" "Dad does," Sophie said, "from his business." I shook my head sadly. "No, darling, I do. I bought that apartment. I pay the monthly fees. I pay for your school tuition. I pay for the car your mother drives. I pay for the vacations we take." They stared at me in silence. The reality of their world was crumbling. "Your father's business doesn't make money," I continued, "and your mother doesn't work. For 18 years, I have supported our entire family." "But why stop now?" Leo asked, confused. "Because helping someone is only help if it allows them to eventually stand on their own," I explained. "If you help them forever, you are crippling them. I have made your parents weak. I have taught them that money appears by magic, that consequences don't exist. And the other night, your mother said some very hurtful things that made me realize she doesn't respect me. She only likes what I provide." Sophie looked down at her plate. "She said you were just an ATM. I heard her tell Aunt Jenna on the phone." I felt a sharp pang in my chest, but I nodded. "Yes." "And nobody deserves to be treated like an object, Sophie. Not even a grandmother. I am closing the bank of Grandma not to hurt you, but to force your parents to become the adults they need to be. If I don't do this, they will never learn. And worse, they will teach you to be the same way." "What about school?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet. "I will pay for your education directly to the school," I assured them. "I will make sure you have medical care, but the fancy clothes, the gadgets, the trips, That is up to your parents now. If they want those things, they must work for them." Sophie looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a long time. "It must suck," she said, sounding very much like a teenager, "to do everything for everyone and have them treat you like garbage." "It does suck, Sophie," I laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh. "It sucks a lot, but it's over now." The next few weeks were a chaotic blur of legal maneuvering and emotional blackmail. Julian showed up at my gate twice. I didn't open it. Isabella sent long emails detailing how I was ruining the children's lives, how I was a bitter old woman jealous of her youth. I forwarded them all to Marcus to keep on file. On the 29th day, the moving trucks arrived at the Park Avenue penthouse. I wasn't there, but my property manager was. He reported that the place was a mess, holes in the walls where pictures had been ripped down, carpet stained. But they left. They moved into a small 3-bedroom rental in Queens. It was a decent neighborhood, but a far cry from the Upper East Side. 3 months passed. I stuck to my guns. I didn't send a dime. One rainy Tuesday in November, my phone rang. It was Julian. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello, Julian." "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded different, tired, rougher. I waited. I wasn't going to fill the silence for him anymore. I wanted to tell you something," he said. "I got a job." "Oh?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Yeah, it's not in tech. I'm working project management for a construction firm in Long Island City. It's hard work. The hours are long. And how is that going?" "It's exhausting," he admitted. "But I got my first paycheck yesterday. It's not much, not compared to what you used to give us, but it covered the rent and the groceries." I smiled, alone in my study. "Good, Julian. That is good. Isabella is working too," he continued. "She's at a boutique in the city, sales associate. She hates it, honestly. She comes home with her feet swollen, complaining about rude customers." I took a sip of my tea. Karma has a poetic sense of humor. Sounds like she is gaining some perspective on what it's like to be on the other side of the service industry. "She is." Julian laughed dryly. "Listen, Mom, I'm not calling to ask for money." "I know," I said softly. "I'm calling because—" Well, Sophie showed me her grades. She got straight A's. She said she wanted to show you, but she was afraid you wouldn't want to see us. My heart softened. The anger was fading, replaced by a cautious hope. "Bring them over on Sunday, Julian. Just for lunch. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. Nothing fancy." "Really?" "Yes, but Julian? Yeah? If Isabella makes one comment, just one, about the house, the food, or money, the visit ends immediately." "I understand, Mom. She won't. She's too tired to argue anyway." That Sunday, the blue sedan pulled into my driveway. It wasn't the luxury SUV they used to drive. That had been repossessed weeks ago. It was a used Honda. Julian got out, looking thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, but he carried himself differently. He walked with a purpose. Isabella got out slowly. She wasn't wearing designer silk. She was in jeans and a simple sweater. She looked humbled. Sophie and Leo ran to me, hugging me tight. We sat in the kitchen, eating soup. The atmosphere was tentative, fragile but real. "So," Julian said, breaking the silence, "my boss is a tyrant. He screams if we're 2 minutes late." I looked at him. "Welcome to the workforce, darling. Your father used to say that if you're on time, you're late." Isabella looked up from her soup. "I had a customer yesterday," she said quietly. She threw a dress on the floor because I didn't have her size. She called me incompetent. I looked at her, seeing the fatigue etched into her face. It is painful when people treat you as if you are beneath them, isn't it? Isabella met my gaze. Her eyes welled up with tears. She didn't look away. "Yes, Evelyn. It is. I never understood." "You didn't have to understand," I said, "because I protected you from understanding. That was my mistake as much as yours." "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for what I said at the dinner, for all of it." I nodded. "Thank you, Isabella." We didn't magically become a perfect family that day. There was too much scar tissue, too much history. But as I watched my son clear the table, something he had never done in his life, and watched my daughter-in-law help wash the dishes, I realized that the eviction notice was the greatest gift I had ever given them. 6 months later, I found myself in Paris. I was sitting at a cafe in Montmartre, watching the artists paint in the square. I had rented a small apartment there for the spring, something I had dreamed of doing with Arthur but never found the time for. My phone pinged with a photo. It was from Julian. It was a picture of him holding a certificate, Employee of the Month. Underneath, he wrote, "Bonus check coming in. Taking the kids for pizza. Miss you, Mom." I smiled and put the phone down, turning my face to the Parisian sun. For 18 years, I had believed that love was about providing. I thought that by smoothing every road, I was expressing my devotion, but I had been wrong. Love isn't about removing obstacles. It's about believing that your children are strong enough to climb over them. Love isn't a blank check. It is a mirror that shows them who they can be. I took a sip of my wine, a cheap, delicious house red that I paid for with my own money, enjoyed in a life that was finally, truly my own. I wasn't just Evelyn the provider anymore. I was Evelyn the woman, free at last. And my family? They were struggling, yes. They were tired, yes. But for the first time in their lives, they were real. And that was worth more than all the gold in my vault.